And Leslie, for a person who's re-entering from jail or prison, how does having housing make a difference in their lives? And maybe also, can you talk about why you were motivated to do this work to address the barriers that people face when re-entering and accessing housing?
Sure. Thank you, Kimberly. Good morning, everybody. I just wanted also to let everybody know I am formerly incarcerated. I was released from federal prison 2 years ago. But to answer your question, permanent stable housing determines if a person will have a successful reentry or not. And I emphasize the word permanent when I say housing. The homeless rate for formerly incarcerated people far exceeds the homeless rate of the general population. Statistics show that those returning home from prison are 10 times likely to become homeless than others. This disparity is particularly pronounced for Black and Brown people, which further exacerbates the disparate impact that the criminal justice system has on Black and Brown communities. Even though we are the minority population, Black and Brown people make up the majority inside prisons. Therefore, upon reentry, we make up the majority of the homeless population. Permanent stable housing allows persons to successfully reenter after incarceration. It reduces the recidivism rate. It reduces the homeless population by 75%, and that's a big number. If we house those with criminal records, there'll be less homeless people on the street. It also lowers the crime rate. We all know that when you are homeless, you're susceptible to arrest. If you're on probation, if you're arrested for trespassing, loitering, drinking in public, anything like that, you go back. And you're not getting out if you violate probation. So although if you're homeless, you're more likely to commit a crime, to keep a roof over your head. So not housing folks contributes to public safety. We all know that homelessness separates families. When you have a stable housing, you're able to reunite families. I have women who are coming out of prison right now trying to gain custody of their children, which they were separated from due to their incarceration. To gain custody of their children, they have to have a stable home. So having a stable home changes how society sees you. Housed people are employed people. Housed people are happy people. Housed people are happy families. We have to keep families together. And housing determines so much for an individual. That stigma, it follows you, it creates barriers. Housing has been weaponized by public housing authorities as a tool. They use it to control you. And this is why I say use the hashtag always decriminalize housing. At Justice for Housing, we're committed to ending housing discrimination and homelessness for individuals in the criminal justice system. They're trying to build a $50 million prison right now. We're trying to end incarceration of women. We can do better. With $50 million, we can provide resources in our communities. With our role in that movement to end incarceration of women and girls is preventing incarceration, providing alternatives to incarceration by creating equitable housing. When I worked with the National Council for Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls, we did a survey. We asked 100 formerly incarcerated women what led to their incarceration, and lack of affordable housing was the number 2 answer. The number 1 was employment. These issues are contributors to incarceration. When I was in a halfway house, the women who had not lived with their children for decades were now able to go home. But before you can go home, probation has to do what they call a house check. They have to contact your landlord or the public housing authority if your family receives housing assistance. What the public housing authorities are doing is refusing to put folks on the lease because of their criminal record. This prompts a denial from probation. Public housing authorities have that much power. They can control who stays in your house because they pay your rent. I thought this was just so wrong. So this is why I started doing this work. I watched my friends being separated from their children once again, forced to go into homeless shelters. It didn't make any sense to me why public housing authorities would do this. They are contributing to the homeless problem in states. When people have safe living homes to go home to, they're refusing to let them go home. They're forcing women into vulnerable situations where they're vulnerable to arrests, assaults, and jeopardizing their freedom. They have these harmful policies, and I call them booby traps. They want you to go back to jail just because they don't want to house you. So this is why I do the work that I do.
Thanks, Leslie. You guys, I totally interrupted Leslie with a text because I'm timekeeping. So thank you so much, Leslie. I think that Henry, Leslie set the context for why this is so important. I want to, because I know all of you guys listening are curious about some solutions. And so we want to jump into what some of the panelists have been doing. And so, Alan, since you direct housing authorities, that you provide public housing and vouchers, housing authorities often deny people, as Leslie talked about, deny people with a record from housing, and yet you're providing housing specifically for people with a record. Can you tell us about the program and why you thought it was important to create it?
Thank you, Kim. I can start out on why it was important because I would hear stories like what Leslie just gave us. I would sit down and meet someone like Leslie and see a face that had a story with it. Our job is to house people, not create barriers for housing. And it's pretty simple. You need an address to open a bank account. You need an address to apply for a job. You need an address to register for school. This is just a very basic need that people have. And then what we would see, I've been doing this for a long time, and I would see the type of criminal records that an applicant would have, and it would not tell the story. For example, someone with drug use, the story is far more complex. It may involve mental illness and self-medication and comorbidity and things that a lot of people would not necessarily think to look for. And then that made us realize that the criminal justice system is disproportionate to people with low income, would not necessarily have the same resources. Someone who's more affluent, some type of charge is an inconvenience and a fine. But for someone of low income who doesn't have access to legal help or how to navigate a complex system, it can lead to incarceration. And that affects someone's life forever, as Henry well put. I had programs that I felt were very understanding and extending to persons with criminal backgrounds. But then about in 2015, I was approached by New York University Marin Institute, and I really have to talk about the value of partnerships that leverage resources right away, right here. Because what they wanted to do is they wanted to look at a demonstration program that for people reentering from incarceration with very strong wraparound services, instead of just putting someone in four walls and saying, here's your rental assistance and good luck, was also to help them navigate the very difficult situations of transportation and finding employment and making sure that you didn't make some misstep that brought you right back into prison again, because everything felt like a minefield for the people we were serving. And so what happened was we did a very small, simple demonstration program. I got permission from HUD to do some public housing units. And then I approached Illinois Housing Development Authority, which is a statewide agency that does programs and also allocates the low-income housing tax credits for the state of Illinois. And they gave me permission to do like 10 set-aside units. And we did that for about 24 months, and it was very successful. It had an 80% success rate of recidivism, as opposed to 48% for people on the state as a whole, as measured by Illinois Department of Corrections. And so, and then everything was just lucky coincidence from this. At the same time, the Illinois Housing Development Authority was part of a task force that was set up by the governor that included the entire state, and how to find solutions for a reentry population. And really, not to diminish the work, but the solutions were pretty simple. You needed affordable housing, you needed employment. And they invited me to join. And out of the 70 partners, I was the only public housing authority, and there are 138 in the state. And so I felt very fortunate to be able to bring our voice to that. And Illinois Housing Development Authority, IDA, recognized our housing program that we were using with their state-funded project-based vouchers, where we had to use their voucher with a specific property owner in a specific home. And so that was reported to the state, and the General Assembly did a statewide demonstration program of 100 vouchers. And so, of course, we applied, and we got the highest award you could get, which was 30, that covered a 3-county area. And then along with doing this and the happy coincidences, I realized that as I got more involved in this, I could use technical assistance, because I wanted this story to be able to be retold and retold as a successful story to other housing authorities. And I'm sorry, my phone buzzed and I thought it was a timer from you, and I looked down and almost lost myself for a minute.
We got 2 more minutes or so, Alan.
Because I forgot where I was, but it was the state task force. Oh yeah, okay. And so we got those vouchers to do for the 3-county program, and it's been very successful for us. So now the General Assembly is looking at doing another 100 demonstration vouchers. And and I'm sorry, it was Vera that I was thinking of. So Vera Institute of Justice, we were fortunate to get their opening doors to public housing program, and because of our program, they're working with us and Maker Housing Partners out of Colorado. And HUD was aware of what we did with the set-aside. So now HUD is doing through their Policy and Development and Research Department, they're doing a study of how they might replicate their program for housing authorities nationwide. So this is pretty exciting for us. All these, it's just the value of the story and the partnerships that bring us to these places.
Great, Alan. Thank you. That is so, your leadership is amazing, and you're very humble in saying, oh, it's just a lucky instance. But the fact is that the state called on you. And so we're lucky to have you today. I want to switch over and talk to Leslie a bit, because Leslie, you're also creating solutions here in Massachusetts in a variety of ways. And so if you can talk about all the different ways that you are trying to address barriers to people getting housing, we'd love to hear.
So, yes, we have 2 pieces of legislation, SD 2193, HD 3297, sponsored by Senator Sonia Chang Diaz and Representative Liz Miranda, which is like the ban the box model. It disallows landlords from asking for a criminal background check, but for failure of passage, it doesn't cover all crimes, but it is a step in the right direction. I figure in a few years, we'll be able to cover more crimes and refile to add those additions. Another bill we are working on is HD 401. It amends the current affordable housing law, which is Chapter 40B, and that says, when you build housing in Massachusetts, 20 and 25% of those units have to be affordable. Our bill, HD 4041, amends that. It says that 5% of the affordable housing will be allocated to those with convictions, those with criminal records. But it also provides a tax incentive for real estate developers. So we're drafting the language. From my understanding, our representative, our sponsor, Nikki Aguado, is adding a disability component to the bill. So I can't wait to see what that comes out to look like. You can sign our petitions on our website, justiceforhousing.org. But we also develop a model. We have a model. It's called the hands-on defense model. And with this model, like Alan was talking about, those mitigating factors, we're able to present somebody, change that narrative, make somebody human, right? Because they're just looking at your query when they deny you. And they don't get into what has that person done to rehabilitate themselves. So what we've done, we've able to disrupt the screening process that public housing authorities use to exclude people with criminal records. And through the appeal process, we've been successful in reversing those denials because of a criminal background. We're in the process of setting up trainings right now because we want everybody to learn how to do this model. So we're going to be training other organizations who want to learn how to use this model. In May, you can book a training on our website. We also work closely with Nubian's reentry services. My sister, Stacy Borden, has a beautiful reentry home, which is deals with healing and trauma from incarceration. Instead of a punitive approach with like the halfway house I was in, it has a social approach, right? And women get the help and healing that they need. And so what Justice for Housing will do is when they are completed that residential reentry, we're going to be help housing the women that graduate. We also have a stabilization emergency assistance program where we're developing resources so that when people come out of prison, we can provide them first, last, and security. Or if they're held on bail for a couple of months and their rent's back due, we want to be able to keep them housed, right? Because we don't want anybody to lose their housing. So those are some of the programs that we're developing and that we actually are doing right now.
Yeah. Leslie, I love that. I feel like your organization has such an expansive, like helping people right here in the moment. And then also just the statewide, like how can we look at the system and change the system to be responsive to the barriers that we know people are facing. So
yeah, because when you come out of jail, you don't have the money for first, last, and security. You can get a job, you can pay the rent, but you can't accumulate that lump sum. And that right there, is that, go back to jail, period. So yeah. Make sure people have that resource.
Yeah. Thank you. So Henry, you've worked across the country on this policy. So you on this issue, and you've seen a lot of different efforts to make change. And so I was wondering if you can speak from that perspective. And I know we've been talking a lot about public housing and vouchers, but we know that the private landlords also similarly have the same kind of barriers. So I'm just wondering if you can speak from your experience about some of the solutions that you are finding to be really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I echo your thoughts, Kim. I'm always blown away with all that Leslie and her colleagues are doing. It's amazing how holistic and comprehensive it is. I'd like to talk about just two kind of higher level policy interventions. The first ones are what we call fair chance housing ordinances that Leslie just touched on and that Leslie's leading the charge on here in Massachusetts. What do these interventions do? Some of them are what's called ban the box, so delaying the moment when housing providers can look at arrest and conviction history until after an applicant's able to put their full self forward, whether they're able to pay, whether they comply with PET requirements, whether the unit, if there's an affordability requirement, whether they meet those standards. So they put their whole self forward as far as elements that are relevant for them being a good tenant. And then arrest and conviction history comes in later. There are also other ordinances that go a little bit further that bar the consideration of specific types of criminal record information from the housing process as a whole. So these are spreading across the country. Hopefully it's coming to Massachusetts very soon. Washington State has a really comprehensive policy. New York City, just last Thursday, I believe, the city of Ann Arbor, Michigan, passed a really amazing policy. So all sorts of sizes of jurisdictions, from the very, very small to the very, very large, entire states are passing these laws. A few common features of effective fair chance housing laws. One of them is that these laws usually help housing providers. They help them by providing rubrics, individualized assessment criteria, thoughtful guidelines on what good mitigation looks like, so that it's not just a policy that stands on its own, but it's a policy that's part of an ongoing conversation about humanizing and welcoming back home people with records. Good fair chance housing ordinances are also even and open. When we were working on an ordinance in Cook County in Chicago, we talked about how we didn't want a Swiss cheese ordinance. We didn't want an ordinance that had lots of carve-outs and holes and spaces where people who need housing, who really need housing, are falling through the cracks because of arbitrary, usually overly legal and legalistic categories to cut people out of the protections of the law. And interestingly, too, landlords and providers don't like Swiss cheese policies. They're hard to administer. They're hard to think about. They open you up to legal liability. And the last thing that's successful about these policies is that they often require institutional buy-in and coordination. If you pass an ordinance that touches the Mrs. Murphy landlord who's got an apartment downstairs, as well as big institutional players like Alan and his colleagues, you're going to need a common conversation for housing applicants and for providers. So that's policy number one. And hopefully we'll see it soon here in Massachusetts and more in the Northeast, because it's been slow to come over to this coast. The second thing, and this is something that's really, I think of kind of as the next frontier, are policies that provide some sort of quality control and filter on the use of records themselves. I don't know if anyone has ever run a background check. We probably all had background checks run on us. But we are all a click and a few credit card details away from ordering wildly comprehensive and often wildly inaccurate information about every single person on this Zoom. It's a very tricky area of the law. We don't need to get into the wonky details today. Happy to follow up and send a report that I just published about this topic later, if that's your cup of tea. Suffice it to say that there's really varying quality. Issue number one is that the databases aren't updated evenly. There are hundreds, even thousands of databases that feed into these background check reports. I once worked with someone who had a very, very common name, think John Smith, in the city of Peoria, Illinois, had lived there for decades. He was in his 50s, and he had never had any interaction whatsoever with the criminal legal system except for a parking ticket when he was a dumb high schooler at 17 or 18. And yet, every single time that he applied for housing, he had a background check that was miles and miles long, because the number of people with his exact name, his exact municipality, his general age range was really comprehensive. There were John Smiths in Alaska, not his actual name, but there were John Smiths in Alaska who had murder convictions or who had drug convictions that did not relate at all to John Smith in Peoria, and he was getting denied because of that John Smith in Alaska. Issue number two is that these databases really facilitate discriminatory behavior by hiding people behind arbitrary statistics and arbitrary records. So when I was writing a report on this issue, I pulled up a record for myself. Instead of saying, giving a comprehensive vision of who I was, of if anything popped up that was a red flag for this monitoring system, it did two things. It gave me a risk score that was at a score out of 100, and it gave me either a thumbs up or thumbs down. And so I don't have any arrest or conviction information on my record whatsoever. My risk score was still in the high 70s. Not sure why that's the case. And I got a thumbs down. Imagine that you do have a record. Imagine that you've been looking for housing for months and months or years and years to no avail. And the landlord runs a check on you. You might have had your record sealed or expunged. You might present mitigating circumstances, but all that landlord sees is a thumbs up or a thumbs down. And a C- or a 70 out of 100 risk score. That's going to be really hard for you to get over because you've been given this blanket label and because you're being evaluated along criteria that you have no access to. I have no idea why. I sent them a technical support message that was long and detailed and filled with case law that they probably did not like. But I have no idea why I got that thumbs down, and I have no idea why I got that really negative risk score. So these, the proliferation of these records and their easy access is a real barrier to things like fair chance housing policies. And just last, to wrap up, two things that these solutions have in common. One, and we talked about this with fair chance work, they involve lots of different stakeholders. They involve people applying, they involve anti-discrimination commissions and human rights commissions, they involve housing providers, and everyone needs to be at the table to figure out what that new conversation looks like that has an appropriate and minimized role for records. And the second thing is that these, and yes, database often means algorithms. Alicia Crowley saw that in the chat. The second thing is that once a law is passed, there needs to be a lot of work that goes into enforcement, because unfortunately the use of records has become so commonplace that most landlords or providers, even if they're not trying to be discriminatory, even if they have all the best intentions in the world, you run a check. That's what you do. And so there needs to be ongoing work to rethink what a record means, how it's not related to our collective well-being and safety, and how we can all do better and do more to welcome people home.
Thank you, Henry. Henry, if the report is publicly available, can you link to it in the chat?
Absolutely. And I saw a few questions that I'm happy to respond to.
Yeah, I think so. Well, here's the deal. It's like we had just had a couple more like panel questions and then wanted to open it up to questions more generally. So is that okay if we kind of finish up the panel and then open it up to questions?
Absolutely. I just meant if there are any questions in the chat, happy to type away.
Okay. Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I don't want to interrupt Alan and Leslie. I want to listen to
them. Okay. So we've heard some amazing types of solutions, and there are always barriers. Actually, Henry already talked about some of the barriers. But Alan, can you talk from a housing authority perspective, what kinds of barriers did you face in trying to implement your program, and how did you get through them, or starting to get through them?
Yeah, but first I have to comment on Henry's presentation a second ago on the unreliability of records, because I can personally attest to this. I finished school, started my student loan of 1,000 years, and immediately discovered there's another Alan Zias out there with the exact same spelling of my name, who is not a financially responsible person, who is still wandering around the United States being a not financially responsible person. And it's hard for people to separate that. There would be another name with that exact spelling. So, and I've run into applicants who had that too many, many times, Henry. But I'm sorry I had to stray. I just had to touch on that. But with the obstacles, the biggest obstacle has been that we're a public housing authority, and the misperception and misunderstandings that come with that. We often see people point at housing authorities as places that create crime, create poverty, rather than places that could be solutions for community safety and for helping people go to self-sufficiency. Another big obstacle I faced was the one strike policy in the 1990s, and it is permeating to us today, many, many years later. And everybody has this very, very strong mindset, and it is built into the policies that a lot of housing authorities use of one strike and you're out, one strike on your record and you're not in. And there was a famous case that happened out of Oakland Housing Authority that tested this at the very beginning. And it was such a simple thing. A grandmother had a grandson visiting her in her unit. And the Housing Authority discovered it. And this is many years ago, so I don't want to, speak of anyone there today. And they discovered the person was there and had a drug history, and they started evicting the grandmother over it. And it shows of the incredible zealousness that was brought to this, and the mindset that was ingrained into people. And then I found that some of my obstacles were the people who provided the housing and the funding. HUD, I thought, I contacted them, and they ended up not being an obstacle. They were fantastic. I believe the woman's name is Felicia Gaither of the Washington, D.C. office, who was like incredibly helpful to me in setting up set-aside units, because usually that's something that's very difficult to do at first. And so I really had to mention her name. The Illinois Housing Development Authority letting me do set-asides. I mean, I can have the most grandiose ideas possible, but without these stakeholders who have the housing, I can't do it. The landlords, you can have the voucher, but if you can't find a landlord to use it with, it's worthless. And so, we had to find landlords who would be willing to work with the program. We had to create those relationships with them one-on-one so that they would feel comfortable and work with us. And then finally, I'm not the sole decision maker. It's the Housing Authority Board. I had to convince them. And coming out with a program like this, it usually brings caution right away. And so I had to show the story of people who were affected by the policies that we have and how housing them made a difference. The story was so powerful. The faces of people who affected by reentry are so powerful in helping me through these obstacles. I involved residents because that could have been another obstacle when in the voucher program, somebody's out in the community, but in our public housing buildings, the word can get around fast, and I didn't want anyone suffering from that. So we were very transparent with our residents to begin with, and that could have gone both ways, but I was very fortunate that residents were very understanding when everything was very carefully explained to them, and we were very transparent, and they didn't find out anything on their own. We engaged stakeholders and especially community leaders. And just yesterday morning, I was meeting with a mayor of a city where we're going to be doing this reentry program, and they had questions. And at the end of this, they told me that the comfort level they received was that I would drive out to that city and sit down with them at a table and take them step by step through what we were doing. And again, the stories of the people that were affected. Those are in the very ground level that we start getting to, all the way to the macro level I was speaking of. And then the same thing that Leslie was talking about with legislation, that is so important. Illinois is being very progressive right now. There's a state bill that just got passed and is going to the governor. And this would be a bill specifically for public housing authorities. And it's really pretty simplistic. There's no kind of measure for helping persons with reentry and recidivism. And so this starts establishing a baseline so we can start measuring.
Wait, Alan,
did I go past the time period?
No.
No. Okay. All right.
About a minute.
Okay. And so the state bill I was talking about, which establishes baselines and measures now, and then also requires housing authorities to give persons denied the right to an informal hearing. It gives them the right to see the criminal and the credit record they were looked that was made for the decision. These are things that housing authorities are already required to do by HUD. So it's unfortunate that the state has to reinforce these kind of things and bring another oversight at the state level. And then, I spoke a moment ago about landlords and getting landlords involved. We run across the country with the difficulty of the single income limit, really the discriminatory practice. If someone has a voucher, of not leasing to them. And so the state also has a source of income legislation that's going through right now, so that people cannot be denied because they're using a voucher and that their source of income. And that's important as an obstacle to overcome with these programs as well.
Thank you. That would have been a harsh way to cut you off, Alan, is to just mute you.
I've been cut off in harsh ways before. It's okay.
All right. So just two more questions, and one for you, Leslie. Just basically the same question as Alan, but you're doing such different work. Like, what are the barriers that you face, and how are you trying to overcome them?
Well, homelessness for those with criminal records has become a public health, safety, and crisis. I say this because nobody wants to house them. I have cases right now where folks are working full-time jobs and have been home for years, have successfully re-entered, and private landlords, they don't want to house them, right, because of their past discretions. And, unfortunately, I focus on public housing authorities because they set the tone, right? And private landlords follow what they do. So since public housing authorities are excluding those with criminal records, landlords are doing the same thing. Quarries have ruined people's lives, right? They have separated families. That stigma follows you. You do your time and it still haunts you like a life sentence, right? The barriers formerly incarcerated people face go way beyond housing. It's everything. It's everywhere. We cannot move on with our lives because society is very cruel and brutal and judgmental. Like my mentor, Andrea James, says, we're the last one's hired and the first one's fired, right? So, having quarries like walking around with a scarlet letter. Also, the resources, the government and the states, they want to fund the same people who are causing harm, DOC, policing, housing authorities. The money does not get trickled down to the grassroots organizations. We're boots on the ground. We're in the thick of the harm, right? We see the problems every day. And we need resources to do our jobs. I have several pilot programs right now that will solve the problems. Like Alan says, I've been trying to implement a pilot program that he implemented in Illinois, which is fabulous, Alan. And I'm so glad you did that. And I'm really trying to do something like that here. We have people who are waiting on waiting lists for public housing authorities for 7 years, right? They bouncing around from relative to relatives, couch surfing. Nobody should have to live like that just to get housed. You have to go into emergency shelter and subject yourself to living and help for 2 years. So these are some of the issues.
Did you mute it?
We use that we're dealing with today. The government does not want to fund grassroots organizations. So these are the barriers that I face. Public housing authorities, they're scared to house formerly incarcerated people. So they're just left out in the code. I have a man right now who tried to rent an apartment 6 times. He has the money. He has a job. And private landlords turned him down 6 times because of his record. I have a woman last week who's in Boston Medical Center right now who tried to commit suicide because she was in shelter for 2 years after returning home from jail and then got a denial from a public housing authority. That was her last hope. And so where is she going to go now? So, people with criminal records, they're exhausted, right? They're fed up. And, this is a crisis. This is serious. These are people's lives and people's families are being separated. It's just so ugly out here. If you saw what I saw every day, something really needs to be done about this. And so for me, the barriers are, trying to get the resources to house my brothers and sisters, basically, to get them what they deserve. Everybody deserves a second chance. I don't know if you guys read that Fair Housing or Human Rights, No Second Chance, that article about housing. If you haven't, please read it. It really talks about the state of housing for those with criminal records, the state that it's in and the barriers. I partnered with Harvard Tenant Advocacy Program. We have a report coming out in April 30th that we did a focus group on the harms that public housing agencies have on those with criminal records. And some of the cases are highlighted in there, that the consequences, the collateral consequences, like Alan talks about, the grandmothers who get kicked out because of a grandson, the children that get separated from their mothers, because public housing authorities, they have that much power to tell you your son can't live with you because he's 17 and he committed a crime. And so you have to choose between a mother who has housing assistance or your son. Which one do you keep, right? Your son can't live with you or you lose your housing assistance. That's totally wrong. And nobody should have to live like that in America.
Absolutely. I know you're releasing a report and I cannot wait. I don't know if there's anything more powerful than what you said about the woman who tried to commit suicide because she was turned down again by the housing providers. That's the ultimate impact. So I think, Alan, you spoke to this already, but the last question for anybody who wants to answer it is why is it important that we center people who are directly impacted in this effort to change practices and policies around getting housing? Anybody who would like to answer? Henry?
I can go, although Leslie is the real expert here. But she just gave such a powerful statement. You might want to take like 30-second breather. Leslie, do you want to go? I'm also happy to contribute.
Because we're the experts, right? We know what went wrong, right? We know what we did not get. So, and we know how to fix it. Crime is not inherited. You are not born that way. It's made by circumstances, poverty, over-policing, lack of resources. Folks are trying to survive with the hands that they've been dealt. Situations with which systems of powers have created, right? It's not a coincidence that communities of color don't have the resources in their community. The system is doing exactly what it's built to do. They know that if you deprive people basic human rights such as equity to jobs and housing, what the outcome will be, right? Our lived experiences, you can't study that, right? I don't care how many degrees you acquire, how many acronyms you have after your name. You can't provide that rawness, the truth that we should have a seat at the table every time when decisions are being made about us. We have the saying at the National Council for Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls, nothing about us without us. It's one of our pet peeves. Folks want to do surveys about us. They want to interview us. They want to study us, but not include us when the decisions that affect our lives and our children's lives. And it's not right. That's why I'm thankful to Monique Jaminis, associate at Brigham Women's Hospital, assistant professor at Harvard Medical School. She did a study on the spread of COVID-19 inside prisons across the country, and she included me. I was part of the advisory board. And, I stayed in it from the beginning to the end. And, what I'm saying is that we should be included, give people formerly incarcerated a seat at the table, right? Contract them, compensate them, just like you would pay a person who has a PhD or a doctorate, because our lived experiences, truthfully, are much more valuable than someone who just studies us. The barriers that are triggered and heightened due to housing insecurity is a factor that further contributes to justice involvement. Therefore, in order to end the state's mass incarceration crisis and ongoing criminalization of low-income communities, access to stable and affordable housing is an absolute necessity.
Well said. Henry, did you want to add?
I think the only thing I would say is I think I've unfortunately been in a lot of contexts where people with all of those acronyms after their names think that sometimes that formerly incarcerated people will be good for a press conference or good for a brochure or a flyer or a Facebook post or a video, but not be the best policy advocates. And I think that is just flat out wrong. I think in two big moments. One is in designing the policy, because people who have never navigated the barriers then try to think about how to take them down. And it's just not an effective method. The second is that we all know that the legislative process is really messy. The sausage does not get always made in a straightforward way, in a way that goes in one direction, in a way that doesn't have hard compromises and hard decisions. And the people who will bear the brunt of the consequences of any compromise that happens should be the ones making those tough decisions. So those are my only two cents to add to what Leslie said.
Thank you. Yeah, perfect. Okay, you guys, we have a good 20, 25 minutes. Would love to open it up to questions for any of the panelists. So I know some of you have put some stuff in the chat, but please feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions. Or offer your own solutions if you have been implementing them.
Might be easier if it just goes into the chat just to keep this everyone on the screen. But
okay.
You know, I can add, Kim, if helpful. We put someone on the board who makes the policy decisions, who has incarceration history. You know, we have I serve a couple of different housing authorities, and on one of our boards, when excuse me, our board members were looking at this issue very early on a few years ago. We have resident commissioner for both of them, and they were struggling a little bit with. They kind of got off base. You'll notice that a lot of housing authorities, a lot of communities will blame their problems on whatever big urban center there is nearby. And in Illinois, it's Chicago. Chicago must be where all the problems are happening from and going, you know, downstate. And so they were looking a little bit at the policies and how they should do this and what kind of exposure it might place them in. And my resident commissioner suddenly, out of the blue, was telling how she came from Chicago, and she had been in prison for a time, and so these policies were important to her personally, and it was like an incredibly watershed moment. One of the commissioners said, "But your daughter's an honor student, and you have a garden at your house." I mean, that was literally said, you know, like this was but you were like an alien from outer space. And it really made a huge difference. It really turned the dynamic there. So Leslie, your stories are very impactful. Thank you for sharing them.
Yeah, Alan, you know, I have to call you. I really am interested about the program that you did in Illinois. I would love to mirror that here.
Yeah, well, it sounds like Sophie Chambers is on the same page as you, Leslie. Would it be possible to try to replicate what Alan did in the Midwest here in Massachusetts in regards to creating space and housing authorities for folks with criminal records? How might that happen? Alan, do you have thoughts?
No, perhaps, you know, I hope I got her first name right, but it was Miss Gaither out of the HUD office, and I hope she doesn't be upset that I tossed her name out there, but she was so helpful. And what I had done, what I had done, and that I think is within the reach of every housing authority, is to do a set aside of units, because we're serving many many different populations with many different needs. And, it was well pointed out by Leslie a moment ago that you could wait years for a voucher. And so it could be years to be discovering if a program has success or not. But if you can do a set aside, that's within the reach of any housing authority. And especially right now, because HUD gave waivers to housing authorities because of the pandemic, to where they can do some pretty precipitous policy changes that will help serve a population. And I think Henry was the one who pointed out, or one of the panelists, about the pandemic in the prisons, which is very well known to people. And this is a way to try to help impact that area as well.
That's a good point, Alan. I've heard, we also heard that about the vouchers that are coming down because of the pandemic, the emergency from the American Recovery Act program. Sorry. And so I think what you're saying is advocating locally with your local housing authority to make sure that some of it is set aside for people who have a criminal background. Yeah.
And send people to the Vera Institute website, because they have their programs that show the success with public housing authorities and the opening doors to public housing authorities. And that's something that a public housing authority can see, that programs have been in place for years, they've been successful, and it's a way for them to do something constructive and be progressive.
Yeah. Lura, sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. Has anyone thought about ways to advocate for more accessible ways to appeal decisions? In my experience, appeals processes with agencies are cumbersome, take a lot of time, often feel insurmountable. Yeah, I know, Leslie.
Yeah, at Justice for Housing, we have this saying, public housing authorities, they say, they have the discretion to deny you, right? And so we say the word discretion means denial, right? That's actually what they're saying. So, yes, we have found a way to disrupt that process. And it is called the hands-on defense model. We have, at the end of April, we're going to have a little cheat sheet on how to disrupt that process on our website. And also, we're going to be doing trainings on how to do that. But to answer your question quickly is when people get a denial, a lot of people who have a criminal record, they just say, that's it, right? There's nothing I can do because I did commit that crime 10 years ago or 5 years ago. And so what am I going to go to a hearing and tell them? There's nothing I could tell them. That's not true. Go to that hearing and make sure you appeal because those mitigating factors are actually your success. Like you being out of jail 5 to 10 years, that's a mitigating factor. That's enough evidence to get you housed, that you're not a threat, that you're not going to recidivate. There's all kinds of, every situation is different. And when I do the training, you have to take it case by case. And so making that person human, telling that person who they are today, not who they were 10 years ago, is effective, right? And that's all you need. The Fair Housing Law says all you need is to show that a person has rehabilitated themselves. And that's easy to do, but people get afraid and people are scared because public housing authorities, they do have too much power. And so I'm challenging them, and everybody's scared to confront them because they consider themselves doing such a good thing, right? They pay people's rent, but they also cause a lot of harm. And they also separate families. And so we have to challenge them every chance we get. Go to the hearing. I tell people, go to the hearing, do the appeal, and tell your story. Tell what you've been doing. Tell them, yeah, I'm working. I'm doing X, Y, and Z. And that will get you housed.
Yeah, and Leslie, there's a question of when the training is going to be, or where, and well, we're
going to be able to. If you're in another state, we can do online training. But if you're here in Massachusetts, COVID allowed, we will come to you and do a training. And at the end of May, we're going to be having, be able to book on my website a training for organizations if they want to know the process that I've created to disrupt this the process of exclusion.
Yeah, great.
Can I jump in here for a second too?
Yes.
This is John. I again, it's stepping a little aside, but just I kind of had to give an extra shout out to really underline what Leslie just said. And actually, I'm one of these people who does hearings for a regional agency as well as doing them occasionally for some other agencies as well. That they're above and beyond the rights people have generally. There are also, and it's really worth how daunting this may be to somebody who's just been turned down, so get help. But there are rules with each of the programs. And some of them, for example, they often found in the Federal Register of these, or the CFR, that really talk about what they are. And if you know them, a lot of things can be brought in, mitigating factors. And also the other thing that's really important to bring forward is this, particularly if someone, for example, is recovering from drug use or something like that, that now that we're talking about a disability, or if there were other disability related issues, then you can ask for a reasonable accommodation to this disability. A lot of the people who do these hearings don't know how to do hearings, don't know what the requirements are, and it's super important that people really call them on that, and if necessary, quote the regulations back to them, because these things are appealable if you go after them. Unfortunately, you probably want to get help to do it. For someone just coming out of jail, obviously, it's overwhelming.
Yeah.
But do that.
John, can I just, because I was going to ask, I saw Alyssa is on the call today, and I don't know if Alyssa Golden from Community Legal Aid, she just put her comment in the chat, and there was also a question that I received, what if something, we're working with a family right now that needs help, what can we do? And so thank you, Alyssa. I don't know if you wanted to unmute and say anything.
No.
Sure, I'm happy to, mostly just in that we are definitely another available resource, and it's so exciting to hear about other resources and other folks. Leslie, the work that you're doing directly with communities and helping people sort of know how to approach these denials, because they are really daunting, they are really discouraging, right? Getting that denial letter is so discouraging, but there are options, for appealing, and appealing is so important. So I just wanted to make sure that our contact information was available. I don't want to take up time on this because everyone who is involved is so wonderful, but I will put my contact information in the chat, and I'm happy to have people reach out to me if they are looking for legal assistance with an affordable housing denial because of criminal records. I put my email in the chat, and feel free to write it down. Leslie and I would love to connect with you later. So you're gonna be hearing from me. I'm gonna reach out because I want us to know each other.
Yeah, I'll put my email in the chat too.
Great. And I did want to mention one other thing in the studies on the HIA around this, the consideration of mitigating circumstances. Most housing authorities issue a denial, and then you can request an informal hearing at which you can present those mitigating circumstances. But there are a few housing authorities notably in New Orleans, who actually, if something comes up in the background check, before they issue the denial, they will have you come in and talk with the housing authority screening staff. In that case, I think they have like a 3-person committee. And it's just because that denial, like Leslie and others have said, is like daunting, like, oh, I'm denied, I'm done. So the fact to not be denied in the first place and then to be able to have that conversation is helpful. So getting housing authorities to change that. Alan, you look like you have something to say.
Yeah, we do that. So I'm so excited that was brought up. Housing authorities do have that power. And it's called the grievance settlement. And, people are welcome to look at our policies online. It's the step before the informal hearing, which sounds scary and it actually is very onerous to everybody, the housing authority, the person. You got to set aside time for something that might be resolved very simply with just a couple people in the room. We're careful not to wear a suit and tie when we do this, so that we're not intimidating, and to invite someone to just simply tell their testimony. And many times that's all we require.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you. Oh, thank you. I'm looking to see if there are other people wrote some really good things in, and I know we missed some of it. Marianne had some success advocating as a case manager with landlords for people with bad quarries. Has anyone else had that experience? And I think some other people put some things. And I will just say again, in this health impact assessment, we're doing one of the things that has come up as kind of like, and as Alan has talked about and as Leslie has talked about in terms of wrapping services around people who are also getting those 4 walls, and how important it is, and really how it's very helpful for not only obviously the person who's reentering, but also for landlords in terms of landlords, including housing authorities, to be able to feel comfortable in making those decisions. And so these types of partnerships exist. And sometimes they're like really fairly formal. Other times they're less formal, like you're talking about, Marianne, about being a case manager who is doing the advocacy for that person. So it's a little bit of a less formal way, as opposed to a partnership with, for example, let's say Leslie and her sister, Stacy, my sister, who have housing that is not related to an agency or an institution, but it's wrapping around those services and supporting people. And so creating those partnerships with housing providers is so important. Okay, trying to see. Any other thoughts, or if there's something I didn't pull out of the chat that someone else is noticing?
I guess just one thing to lift up that Alan touched on in his really concise and elegant answer in the chat is that there are very, very limited circumstances where housing authorities have a obligation to deny people housing. Far more narrow than what floats around in the ether and in folks' heads. So I would encourage people to check out those regulations, and I can post them in the chat for those who work with regulations frequently, because housing authorities have a lot more positive discretion, not just that negative discretion that Leslie touched on, but positive discretion to take away barriers than many folks think. And people like Alan are leading the way on making use of that discretion.
Yes. Alan is a rare a rare breed, and I appreciate you so much, Alan, because the experiences I've had with public housing authorities, I wish they all were like you.
But you humble me, Leslie. Actually, you're the one that I appreciate very much. And I think I put that in the chat. Thank you so much for sharing your story. It's very powerful when someone puts their story and their face out there. Thank you.
So This has been great. You guys had really good questions. I want to thank the panelists. I know we're early, but most people typically appreciate getting 10 minutes of their life back.